Okay, sorry. I will start over now. Hi everyone, good evening, good afternoon. We'll begin by introducing both our speakers. And our speakers, oops. Our speakers today are academics working in the field of anticipatory governance of water. So we will have a program today of um, introductions, and then we have a first presentation by Jayashree Srinivasan. The second presentation is by Heidi Mendoza. And then we have some time for questions from 4:35 to 4:55. And then we have closing remarks. So about Jayashree. Jayashree has a PhD in sustainability from Arizona State University with a specialization in complex adaptive science, system science. Her research focuses on river governance that balances the conflicting needs of water for food, energy, and biodiversity conservation. She uses resilience theory and socio-ecological system science to analyze the ecologies and psychologies of watershed organizations and how decision-making dynamics impact anticipatory and adaptive governance for optimal social ecological health outcomes. Jayashree also has prior research experience in alternative energy solutions for sustainable development and climate adaptation. So Jayashree, the floor is yours, and we really look forward to seeing your presentation.
Oh, sorry, I can't share my screen. You'd have to enable that. I was muted. Okay, now I can. Okay, can you see my screen and hear me well?
Yes, we can see your screen and hear you.
Okay, awesome. So the topic of my presentation is actually based on a paper that was recently published. It was out in December, and it's titled Resilient Organizations for River Restoration. I present here a complex social ecological systems approach, and I use the specific case studies of two river recovery programs in the Colorado River Basin. One is the Upper Colorado River Endangered Fish Recovery Program, which governs the Upper Basin River Recovery and Restoration. And the second program is the Lower Colorado River Multi-Species Conservation Program, which governs the Lower Basin region. So the way I have styled this presentation is I'll run through the objectives and then the theoretical background that I use, the key takeaway messages, and then I'll present the results. I've left the methods section for the last, but in the interests of time, I may not get around to it in the time given for this presentation, but I'm happy to discuss it at a later stage during the discussion section because there's a lot of ground to cover here. So the objectives, the key questions that I want to answer, there are two questions. The first one is, what are the impacts of environmental disturbances on the river restoration governance system? So I was specifically interested in river restoration because the Colorado River and a lot of other arid and semi-arid river systems are heavily utilized and heavily degraded. And there's very few river restoration programs actually in play. So this whole presentation will focus on the Colorado River, but also it's also the findings and takeaways are also applicable to other Western river systems. So this is the first question. The second question is, what role does inter-organizational diversity play in fostering organizational resilience, and what are its effects? So the key questions that I wanted to answer, the topics of interest to me were, what makes the governing organizations resilient and sustainable, because river restoration is a very important topic. So I'll just briefly touch on the key takeaways, and I'll also get back to it later on in the presentation. So my first, okay. So the first point I want to make here is the distinction between institutions and organizations. So there is considerable fluidity and confusion of boundaries between institutions and organizations, and I kind of clarified in this study. Organizations here, I define it as those that are organizations are created with purposive intent and are embedded in an institutional context of sociocultural ideas and beliefs that prescribe appropriate and socially legitimate modes of action. So those are organizations are embedded within an institutional setup or framework. So organizations are formal structures with an explicit purpose and are consciously created, while institutions may develop spontaneously and are often not characterized with a specific purpose. So that's the distinction I make for the purpose of the study. The takeaways from this study briefly are institutionally created penalties and risks for anticipatory capabilities in Western river organizations. It'd be interesting to see if this is equally applicable elsewhere. Western river organizations do not display anticipatory capabilities to biophysical disturbances of short or long duration, but they demonstrate more coping capabilities. And low attitudinal diversity in the face of biophysical disturbances means that they have short-term adaptive capabilities. They demonstrate these, but the lack of constructive conflict and deeper learning inhibits adaptive and anticipatory capacities for longer-term change. So these are briefly the key takeaways. So I'll get into the theoretical background. So I draw on three different broad theoretical backgrounds: resilience theory, social psychology, and organizational science. So first touch on resilience theory. So the building principles of resilience are briefly, there are 7 building principles: diversity and redundancy, connectivity, managing slow variables and feedback, complex adaptive systems thinking, learning, participation, and the level of polycentricity. So for the purposes of this study, I will focus mostly on the maintaining diversity and redundancy, because I use diversity a lot in this study. So there are 3 dimensions of organizational response resilience to current issues, the past as well as the future. So here, anticipatory capabilities refer to the ability of organizations to detect critical developments and to adapt proactively to future changes before they happen. Coping capabilities refer to the endowments actors possess prior to adversity that shape their capacity for positive adjustment. So endowments facilitate resilience by enabling adaptability, and it may include the financial capability, cognitive capability, behavioral capability, emotion regulation capacity, and relational capability endowments. Adaptive capacity is strongly linked to strategic actors that aim toward a reconfiguration of organizational resources, competencies, and routines to meet demands and opportunities in changing environment. So these are the 3 main pillars. So yeah, for this study, I mostly focus on the diversity aspect, and I use that in my methods. So I draw on social psychology as well, and I'm interested in how diversity is measured within and between groups, and which varies based on conceptualization and attributes selected. So you have similarity attraction theories and social categorization theories, which kind of, they draw different conclusions based on how they utilize diversity in team science. Diversity in organizational work units has at its core heterogeneous perspectives, different cognitive mindsets, and creativity. So I use attitudinal diversity in my study. Now, I'm not going to go too much in depth into this aspect, because I'm not going to touch on methods in the interest of time, but I'm open to discussing it during the discussion if there's time. Suffice it to say that, yeah, these are the theories that I've used, drawn on from social psychology, and I use attitudinal diversity drawn from coding archival documents. Organizational science. So this is the model I use for organizational science. So organizations are naturally change resistant with a strong tendency to inertia and they will only change when forced or disturbed into doing something. But once they are disturbed, the track which the disturbance takes through the organization and the degree of transformation will differ over time and across different organizations based on the innate organizational characteristics. So there are four pathways that can characterize organizational responses to environmental disturbance. One is rebuttal, where the environmental disturbance is externalized and or deflected in an attempt to protect and maintain the prevailing organizational equilibrium. Then you have reorientation, where if a disturbance cannot be rebutted by adjusting the internal organizational infrastructure, then it's accepted and assimilated within the workings of the organization. Then you have colonization, where disturbance and change is forced upon the organization by those who have the power over the structure and its resources, and it leads to major shifts that create lasting and fundamental change. And then you have evolution, where it also involves major changes to the organization, but the difference is the change is chosen and accepted voluntarily by all organizational participants without coercion. So these are the four main organizational responses. So the case studies I use here are, this is a map of the upper basin, and it encompasses geographically the entire upper region with the main stem of the Colorado River and all the major and minor river tributaries. It is jointly administered by the Bureau of Reclamation and the US Fish and Wildlife Service. Here you have the points of control, and they're highlighted because these are the major dams and reservoirs. Coordinated reservoir reoperation and flow regulation is one of the major features of the Upper Colorado River Endangered Fish Recovery Program. They provide environmental flows by coordinating all the reservoir reoperations, improving connectivity in key areas where by creation of fish passages and improving connectivity through diversions, habitat restoration, fish stocking, invasive species control. So these are a few key features of the program. And on to the right, you have the Lower Colorado River Multi-Species Conservation Program. It is mostly along the main stem and not so much in the tributaries. There are 25 dams along the main stem, so it's a very heavily regulated portion. It's also jointly administered by the Bureau of Reclamation and the Fish and Wildlife Service. And because of the constraints of this program, where it's mostly constrained to the main stem, what they do is create backwater habitat for preserving fish genetic diversity. And they've also expanded the program to include riparian and terrestrial species. So these programs were created. The Endangered Fish Recovery Program to the left was created in the late 80s, and it's been in operation for over 3 decades now. The Lower Colorado Basin Program was created in the early 2000s, so it's been around for less than half the time, for about half the time of the Upper Basin Program. There's a lot that's going, this is one of the main results of my study. There's a lot going on, but you don't need to read everything, but I'll briefly explain what I actually intended over here. So the first two columns highlight the environmental disturbance and the type. So environmental disturbances are characterized as either press or pulse events, and they are either institutional or biophysical in nature. So press disturbances are more chronic long-term disturbances with long-term impacts, while pulse disturbances are temporary in nature. And while they may cause substantial impacts, these are short-lived and the system has the ability to recover. Institutional disturbances can take the form of broad sociocultural norms and values, legislation, regulatory policies, and market factors, while biophysical disturbances include drought, climate change, and the presence of invasive species, among others. For this study, I've used a limited amount of institutional and biophysical indicators, but there's a lot more to draw from for other studies. So the next two columns provide the region and the duration of the disturbance. The institutional presses, as you can see, are more long-standing and they act over a longer term, whereas the pulse disturbances are for only a very specific period. And then there's the organizational responses and the basis of the attitudinal diversity in the next two columns. And then how they speak to the resilience capabilities of the upper and lower basin governing organizations, restoration organizations. So here you can see for the institutional disturbances, we can see more anticipatory capabilities being leveraged. Whereas for biophysical disturbances, there are more coping capabilities being leveraged. And you only have adaptive capabilities for pulse events. So these are like the key takeaways from the results. As I said, the anticipation of institutional incentives and penalties has built-in anticipatory resilience capacities in both programs. As we can see in the this table, the programs, both the upper and lower basin programs, were created because of the enforcement of the Endangered Species Act. Taking water without accounting for the preservation of endangered species just became too risky, and there were too many financial and legal penalties. So it kind of forced the organizations to form. That is essentially what this is saying. So the anticipatory resilience capacities were formed in anticipation of institutional risks and penalties. Sense making as a part of coping capacities in the face of biophysical disturbances has been displayed by both programs. There were more actors to deal with these disturbances, mostly the pulse disturbances in the short term. So it kind of, that's how the organizations coped. And low attitudinal diversity in the face of biophysical disturbances, it points to short-term adaptive capabilities, but the diversity does not take the form of cognitive diversity, where there's constructive conflict and different ways of thinking, which triggers deeper learning. So these are needed for more adaptive capacities for longer term change. So these are, again, the key takeaways. How am I doing on time?
Yeah, I think you're right on time. I don't know if you have more slides.
Just, yeah, just one more slide. Okay. So just very quickly, my future research, I'd like to touch on how responses to cascading disturbances can be analyzed for resilience capabilities. What differences exist in RBOs with varying mandates, because the points of control such as dams and reservoirs can serve many different purposes. So do the purposes that they serve, do they have different results? And what is the role of different types of trust and other intra-organizational variables in river basin organization longevity and resilience? And here's a link to my paper. I can kind of drop it in the chat if anyone's interested. So that is...
Thank you so much. This was a really insightful presentation. And I think I definitely have a lot of questions buzzing in my mind right now. But before I do ask those questions, I will pass on the floor to Heidi. And yeah, so I will first introduce Heidi. And yeah, just 1 second. Yes. So Heidi is Heidi Mendoza is a PhD candidate from the Water and Climate Risk Group at the Institute for Environmental Studies. Her PhD research focuses on the past and future qualitative storylines of drought to flood events as part of the Perfect Storm project, storylines for future extremes. Before joining VU Amsterdam, she was the project program coordinator for the sustainable and inclusive landscape governance implemented by the Foundation Philippines, Tropenbos International, and Wageningen University and Research. Her work entailed designing and facilitating inclusive and creative dialogues to bring stakeholders together towards sustainable management and governance of Sierra Madre, Palawan, and Bukidnon Misamis Oriental landscapes. I'm so sorry if I pronounced it wrong. In the Philippines. She also led collaborative research work on community forest rights and landscape governance assessments. Prior to her civil society experience, she worked at the University of Philippines as a senior researcher for the Philippine Climate Smart Agriculture Project, Project Sarai. Her work focused on unraveling Filipino farmers' paradigms, perceptions, and practices on agriculture, and combining these social farming contexts to crop models and to real time agricultural monitoring systems. So the floor is yours, Heidi, and I look forward to your presentation. So go ahead. Let me know if you can share your screen. Great. Yeah, we
Yes,
can.
I can share my. Yeah, you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah. All right. So thank you, Nivedita, and hello everyone. Thank you for making time to be with us today. So again, I'm Heidi Mendoza, and this afternoon this day, I have two things I want to accomplish with everyone. First is to play a very quick game. So I only have 15 minutes for the discussion, the presentation, but I will try to play with you a very quick game. And the second thing I want to do is to actually learn from this game and take away the insights and distill the learnings from this game, and also on the case study that I will present after the game. So the game will only work if people will participate. So I think it can work if even if you're using your phone or laptop. So yeah, so here's the game. So we've been talking about anticipating futures in governance. So this is a very quick anticipatory exercise where I will ask everyone, it's quite an intimate group anyway, where I will ask everyone to anticipate about Tinipak River. And I will only give one photo and very few information about the river. So basically you see Tinipak River on the screen. And your role as the game player is to imagine that you live in this landscape where you use the Nepak River for multiple purposes. And for the past 5 years, you have experienced both floods and drought. And also, your local government unit starts an information and campaign about hydrological extremes getting worse in the coming years. So, how you can participate in the game is to send us a short story through chat. I will send a yeah, so the story, it has to have your role in the landscape. It could be a student, a farmer, I don't know, someone from the government. So you can take a role that you want, and you should also be able to tell the time frame. So in which time are you anticipating for the river? Are you anticipating for the river 2 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 100 years from now? And also at the end, of course, you have to tell us the story of your anticipation for the water. So basically, this anticipation exercise lets you play around roles, time, and the actual stories of anticipation. I think we can give 2 to 3 minutes for this. And then, as it is a game, of course, there's a question: how do you win the game? Well, basically, you win if you have the best or most optimal anticipated futures for the river. Okay, so I think we can start the timer now. So 2 minutes for everyone. So again, just send in your chat. You can send more stories than one. You can send multiple stories. Is the instruction clear, Navidita?
Yeah, the instruction is clear. Maybe it would be nice if people could also come on the camera and just speak up with their
Yeah,
story.
yeah,
If
yeah.
you're comfortable.
People can just unmute themselves, or
Or
yeah,
you
if
can unmute yourself and share your anticipation story. Or you can write in the chat as you like. So I don't mind going first. So my story would be that I am a farmer in the region, and that I anticipate that in the next 5 years the hydrological extremes get worse, but in the years after that there is a significant improvement of river health because the community comes together to conserve the river and the river basin, and we don't have this vision of a very doomsday future, but we work together to restore the health of the river. So all the farmers in the region, we use more sustainable practices and in our farmland, and we put together community effort to stop polluting the river, to use the river resources more wisely, and also we put pressure on local governments to take actions to protect the river.
thank you. I hope I captured your story in the chat. So I tried to. Yeah. So people can just unmute, raise your hand, or also just send in the story in the chat. So I think we still have 1 minute And I think for the rest of the discussion, you just can keep sending the stories because I will refer from them from time to time anyway. I think I should have prepared the music for this, but
I mean, I could give it a shot. I don't know how exact it would be because I don't know much about this river system. Um, but let's say I'm a fisherman and I provide fish for local markets. So I'd be interested in, I don't know, at least both the base and the pulse flows and how it sustains the fish. So if there are farmers in the region, then I'd also be interested in water quality and how that affects, I don't know, the fish catch. And generally, if you're a fisherman and you have like a fisherman community, you would kind of expect some organization around who how many there are and how much catch you could sustainably use individually and together as a fishing community. But I would also assume that there would be problems with multi-use. I mean, it may not strike me, but I think I would assume that, yeah, if there are other communities like farming communities using it, then there's not much dialogue between the communities. But I guess as a fisherman, that wouldn't really strike me because I'd be more interested in fishing. So I don't know if that is a piece of story, but yeah.
Thank you, Jaisri. And I think with this game, there's no right or wrong story anyway. We're just really trying to get ourselves into the anticipation mode. And other people actually sent in stories. I'm going to read one from, I hope I pronounced the name right, Ajay. Ajay. I'm a farmer who works near the riverbank. I've been practicing crop rotation because of the alternating nature of floods and droughts. Judging from the pattern in the last 5 years, I have planned my crop to be in accordance with the state of the river. I try to grow crops such as rice during time of floods and try to focus on drought resistant such as corn and okra during the drier seasons. I anticipate that the state of the river will continue, but I hope that the weather does not get extreme enough such that I am unable to grow these crops anymore. I do not think that this will happen in the near future and don't expect much fluctuation in the next 3 years. Yeah, so the other participant can still send in their stories. But basically, I wanted us to get into that anticipation exercise because for the next couple of slides, we'll be talking about water and time and how anticipation plays in river governance, water governance. And I used the theory of anticipation through future coordination to analyze one case study in the Philippines. So basically, the theory of anticipation tells us that there are 3 different types of anticipation. The first would be anticipating day-to-day basis. This would be more technically called pretensions or moment-by-moment anticipation. And I think we do it every day. Checking the weather and basing on the weather what to wear, where to go, what activities to do. These are very micro anticipations that we do on personal basis and on a daily basis. But we also have longer time kinds of anticipation. We call it trajectories or narratives of anticipation. Basically, what trajectories or narratives are, this is when we try to make sense of our experience in time. So when you try to talk to people, I don't know if you've experienced asking people how they experienced previous flood, previous droughts before, people will always, or at least most people will talk about how it started. But you will also notice that people notice the start of an event differently. We don't always refer to the same starting point, and that's how people anticipate. And basically, the theory suggests that depending on how you construct the story, where you start the story actually influences how you foresee or how you anticipate in the future. And lastly, another type of anticipation or future coordination. And when people start to make plans, so Joyce just talked about integrated river basin management. In these kinds of governance mechanisms, people do plan. They make development plans, they make water management plans. And this is that kind of anticipation where we assume that time will unfold as it is passively, that there's 4 years to work for this kind of river. And we try to apply it in the case of Kaliwa Dam. So basically, Kaliwa Dam is a proposed dam in the northern part of the country, of the Philippines, where it's promised, or at least it's supposed to augment water shortage in major cities in the northern part of the country. But this afternoon, I will be talking about how Kaliwa Dam is actually a contested and unnegotiated anticipation that led to mismatches in decisions and actions. And you see the different stories that everyone has sent. So Jaishi was talking about fishermen, so that's a role different than Nivedita. Nivedita took like a farmer, and they were talking about 5 years. Some other people talked about 10 years, so different time scales. And that's actually what happened in Kaliwadang when we put different stakeholders together. So basically, we put different stakeholders together coming from indigenous communities, non-government organizations, researchers, government people. We tried to involve the private institutions or private organizations as much, but it has been difficult. And from the theory of anticipation, we try to analyze how they actually anticipate for Tinipak River, because Tinipak River, once Kaliwa Dam is constructed, it will traverse the whole of Tinipak River to the point that ancestral domains will be lost, the river system will be disrupted. And for this group, where indigenous peoples, NGOs, and local stakeholders, they share the same anticipation, where their daily anticipation talks about daily getting by. How do I get the same amount, same quality of water from Tinipak River? So basically, that's what they think about on a daily basis. On a longer time scale, or their trajectory for Tinipak River, they kept talking about, we've been living here for a time now. We've been living here for the rest of our lives, and we foresee other generations to enjoy Tinipak River, or to enjoy the ecosystems as much as we did. And their plans were actually to come up with decades of restoration and conservation for Tinipak River. None of the indigenous peoples, local stakeholder, anticipated about the dam to actually augment the water shortage problem. And this was a nice visualization of their anticipations. So basically, they wanted to improve the water provisioning and function of Tinipak River, where they see different strategies to do that. First is a more transparent and participatory decision making, where more local stakeholders are consulted, where more local stakeholders are brought into the place of anticipation. And also proper implementation of development plans, because it's not that there are no plans for the river, but it's the question of how are the plans actually implemented? Are people involved in the anticipation? Are people involved in monitoring? Are people involved, incentivized, and these kinds of things? And they also wanted other strategies like behavioral change, through increasing awareness, involving youth sector and more children in these kinds of dialogues, in these kinds of discussions. They also wanted to explore alternative infrastructure projects, because they are not close to the idea of infrastructure. It's just that the dam wasn't in their anticipation in the near and long-term future for the river. And they also wanted to explore more environmental friendly livelihoods, and to implement more sustainable indigenous practices. So this is one of the groups that anticipated for Tinipak River, where they really wanted to harness collaboration, inclusivity, and multi-stakeholder governance for the river. However, on the other end, we have the national government representatives who were really pushing for the dam, who were really already planning to invest in the dam. And their moment-by-moment anticipation for the dam was actually, there is a need to respond to this water shortage. And their trajectory to respond to this water shortage, and the narrative to this water shortage, is that major cities like Manila need more water. Hence, their plans are to merge development, infrastructure, and adaptation measures for long-term and economic environmental benefits. And you see the difference in the narratives that they do, the different in the anticipations that they have, such that at the end we came about these realizations and these insights about coordinating water in time, or basically anticipating water in time. And we see four relevant elements. First would be the roles and power. How and why do we anticipate? Because our role and power in the landscape can actually influence the kind of anticipations we have for an ecosystem. If I am a mayor, if I am a governor, if I am the president, I would probably have a different kind of anticipation for such river compared to an indigenous community, compared to children. And also, do we have perceived agencies over our anticipations? Because if we perceive that we actually have power about our anticipations, probably we would anticipate different things. We would anticipate things that we can actually have control over. And also, another critical element for the anticipation of different groups was the uncertainty. The reason why I just provided very general and loose information for the river is that in reality, we deal with so much uncertainty with climate change. We have so many information about out there, but still, we're still dealing with a lot of uncertainty. And with this certainty comes a question: is there a perfect experience or complete information to guide our anticipation? And I guess our experience with communities and government representatives in Kaliwadam is there's no such thing as perfect experience or complete information. And also, we put out the question: how do we anticipate futures that are unknown or unfamiliar to us? It's difficult to anticipate. At first, we thought it would be easy for people to imagine and to anticipate what they want for the river, but at the end, it was kind of difficult because they didn't know what will change, what exactly will change, and when exactly it will change. And also, another element will be values and negotiations, which was not quite apparent in the governance process because people were not consulted. The dam was already planned about without even asking the communities that will have to be relocated. And I think this is where I highlight that anticipations for water governance and land governance, they're always value laden, they're contested, and they're political. And if this is so, how can governance mechanisms actually open platforms for continuous negotiations? Because we can negotiate about our anticipations, we can negotiate about the futures that we actually can imagine for ourselves. And last element would be the temporal landscapes, where I put out critical questions: what temporal landscapes dominate our anticipations? So I guess for the case of Kaliwadam, it was the national government's temporal landscape that dominated the ecosystem because they wanted to take over the ecosystem using the narratives that they have, using the temporal plans and landscape that they already have in place. And I think also very important questions of plans and temporal landscapes: for whom and by whom. Yeah, so basically that was the experience of Taliwadam and trying to analyze the different dialogues that took place using the theory of anticipation and how different types of anticipation actually manifest in different manners as well. Yeah, and thank you for sharing the stories. I think I saw some more participants send in their stories. If Nivedita can save the chat, I think it would be nice so we can have a copy of their stories. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I will save the chat. And yeah, really interesting presentation from both of you. So yeah, now I open up the floor to some questions and answers. So if anybody would like to speak up and ask the question, that would be great. Otherwise, we can start with what's in the chat. We can also leave a question in the chat. So I do already have a question for Jayashree, and that is about working with organizations. So you work a lot with river basin organizations to embed anticipatory governance into the strategy. So how do you actually get them to accept anticipatory governance as a method or as an approach? Because a lot of these organizations are very traditional, and often they are very not open to new ideas, let's say.
Yes, what you say is true. With regards to how you get them to accept, that's very difficult. I'm as an early career researcher, I guess you would need to be in a position of power because in a lot of instances, the decisions to be made are so highly political, especially since the river basin organizations, they kind of coordinate multi-use. So if you want to talk about, in my case, it was like river restoration. There are so many different, there's the agricultural lobby, there's the recreational industry lobby, there's the cities. So it's kind of really difficult to, get them to accept per se. So my research, I used the I used archival research and coding because I felt that for organizations to kind of anticipate for the future, first we need to see where they are now, what they've been doing, where they are now. So analyzing how they've, coped, adapted, and what kind of anticipatory capabilities they have to what kinds of disturbances is one part of the picture. In the future, I would like to use more participatory methods to kind of engage them in, like, say, sometimes, as Heidi suggested, games, like playing games with them, participatory workshops, these kinds of things. And there was some really cool research that kind of looked at how virtual reality can be used to, in participatory techniques. So there are all these things available, but there's the science of it, there's a politics of it. So it's kind of like really hard to like convince anyone to do anything. It's like a long-term effort. What you can show them, which is, I think this was probably one of my impetus to do organizational research, because it's easier to kind of deal with team exercises than to kind of deal with big picture events that kind of like people would be like, well, we have a lot of problems, so where do we even start? So that's where you're like, okay, so these are this is what you do, this is the impact you have, so how could the teams work better? So I'm kind of connecting the cognitive and the behavioral aspects to the impact. So that's kind of where I kind of hope to make a difference.
Thank
That answers the question.
No, it does. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so Rashmi asks, in India, floods are a regular feature in some parts like Assam and Bihar. Most of these efforts are in crisis management and not anticipatory governance. How do we make a shift in mindset? Can one show some results in the short term, which convince governments to invest in long-term visions? So maybe this question is open for both of you, as you both have some very unique insights on them. Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I'd like to
Go.
make some comments on it, unless Heidi has something to say. What Rashmi, I think what you raised is a very important question, and one that that I have I have been interested in this research and even in past research. There is a short term and then there is a long term. So short term responses and behaviors are for the most part different from long term. So it does not necessarily mean that, say, that if there's like a catastrophe or a crisis in the short term, it would translate to longer term vision. So those are two different ball games. What I'm interested in is bridging the difference between short term and long term, which means addressing, okay, this is how people behave in the short term, but this is how they behave like for like press events, like long-term chronic problems, or this is how they should behave in long-term. So crisis management, disaster risk response, these are more like coping and in some instances adaptive capacities. Anticipatory governance, yeah, it's kind of like, actually, if you look at anticipation of future risks, that too, like for instance, city planning, they kind of anticipate future risks of, say, flooding, and then they respond accordingly. So I guess it's sort of like a case-by-case basis. What I can say is they require two different mindsets, two different capabilities. So yeah, it's two different things. Eddie, would you like to add something?
Yeah, no, I would just like to add, I think in terms of anticipation, as I've highlighted earlier, there are different time scales also for anticipating. You can anticipate and respond short term, and it does not mean that it's not enough. I think how we can change a shift in mindset is actually to open platforms for dialogues and for people who are planning, people who are responding, to actually see that people who are highly impacted, people who are highly impacted of such risks, they have different time scales that they're working on, and that the response does not have to always be just after a disaster. and that there should be spaces and also mechanisms in place to make sure that if another drought happens in an unexpected time, people have at least a buffer that they can cope. And but I do think the shift in mindset can be played around or can be influenced with many different things. I think Jaishi already spoke about it, like virtual reality, and also probably Ajay was talking about experimenting with different simulations. The difficult thing for anticipation is that visually people have to see what will happen. It's easy to say that the temperatures will rise with the by 1 degree Celsius, but what does that look like? What will forests look like with 1 degrees increase? And I think if people actually see, visualize, and put it in a very personal, in a lived experience manner, I think the anticipation can come in more easy, I suppose, and also like a shift in mindset that actually, yeah, this can make a lot of change, like what's happening now in Europe. So there's a lot of heat waves happening in different countries here, but I think visually people were not prepared for such increase in temperature, that they don't know how to cope with it. It's not something that they anticipated probably. So I don't know if that actually provides a very
Yes.
good
If I
answer.
could add,
I just wanted to, yeah. No, I just
uh,
wanted to add that in India, like there's a state called Orissa, which always used to experience cyclone every year or every few years, and a lot of hundreds of people used to die. Then they kind of, they did anticipatory governance there. That as soon as this happens, they will shift everybody to, they made certain provisions to shift people away from the coastline. And so now when the cyclone hits, nothing happens really. I mean, people may lose their homes, but the lives are saved. And so they have succeeded in that particular state with this particular problem, but then that kind of thinking is not seen in every other problem. It might be just a specific person there or a group of people who decided to undertake that exercise. Now it's pretty routine, like the siren will go off and people are evacuated, and before, as soon as a warning comes that there is going to be a cyclone, they're all evacuated. They've identified places where you can shift them, and where various measures have been undertaken. So similar things don't happen with the floods at all. Like
yeah,
every year it just goes on as usual. People have to fend for themselves. That's what I have heard
yeah,
and
there are
seen.
a couple of things at play over there with what you said about floods. So the duration of the floods too, I mean, they can happen annually, like in cities, the monsoon seasons. And because of the infrastructural path dependence, like the already built infrastructure, that kind of makes it very difficult for people to adapt and just move somewhere else. And there's also the thing about like people have their livelihoods in that place, there's a sense of place. So it's more difficult for them to kind of move somewhere else, unless it's kind of like, say, in Bangladesh, they kind of move seasonally somewhere else, but they always come back. So that's kind of become a part of their adaptive cycle. But then floods as well vary. So there are regions that experience like yearly floods, and then there's like the thing like the 100-year flood, and then there's 500-year events. So those kinds of things are harder to come by. But in these instances, there's this thing called organizational or societal memory as well that can come into play. Like if there's a really catastrophic event, people tend to remember that, and then they kind of the main problem there is how do you translate that from, say, one generation to the next if it's an event that occurs over longer time scales. So then how is that information transmitted so that should that event occur again, the people like in the next generation are prepared for that event. So that's kind of that memory aspect is like the crucial point as well.
And Heidi, would you like to add something?
I think I would just like to add on to that concept that I already talked about earlier, that most governments, what they do is to use the development plans or development infrastructure as also the adaptation measures. And when this happens, some communities actually feel a sense of safety, like with a dam. I feel safe because there's a dam. But then again, we don't know with these kinds of extremes when actually a dam can break. And also with this sense of safety, it's, I think, a bit more difficult to ask people to move away. And there's also, as Jaishi said, like a sense of place. yes, I think that's also all what I wanted to say.
So the next question is from Ajay. Ajay, would you like to ask a question yourself?
Seems like
Yeah, sure. Um, so I'm sorry if this is not like the correct question in this case, but to me it seems that anticipatory governance is an obvious choice. For example, if the thing to depending on what is being anticipated. So I think there was an example earlier about the floods in Orissa happening every year, and then the government started to govern around it and anticipate it happening. If that was not the case and the government just ignored it, then it would have to mean to me, it seems that they are completely oblivious to the fact that floods are happening every year. Apart from oblivion, what are some possible reasons why, in a scenario like this, anticipatory governance would not be adopted? Because it seems like an obvious choice.
Yeah, I think this question is maybe answered both by Heidi and Jayashree. Maybe Heidi, you can shed some light upon power in governance, and you spoke about who is governing, like who is the measure being taken for, as you said that the dam was being built for people in Manila and not the locals. So yeah.
Yeah, no, I think as I said earlier, I think it's easy to anticipate things that we've seen before. Like I've seen a flood in 2018, and in my head I could anticipate a flood that looks like 2018. But with climate extremes, it's difficult to anticipate what it looks like. So such that planners or decision makers at the government's end or other decision makers, most of the plans being anticipated are based on the past made present, past made future, because the basis are historical data, experiences of people, all of which in the past, which does not actually work anymore in the future, because in the future there might be different kinds of changes, if that makes sense. And I think your question, for it not to be anticipated, it seems to me the governing body would be oblivious to these changes. This is, I think, um, politically charged, and also uh, it puts in the difficulty of anticipating in such a highly uncertain changing ecosystem. That's what I'm saying. The case for Kaliwadam, I think, like for the case of Kaliwadam, they went through the whole environmental impact assessment process, where when we looked at the report, actually in 5 to 10 years, the dam is not suitable anymore for the ecosystem because it won't hold water anymore, and also the plans for the communities aren't in place. But then that's the only thing they can anticipate to augment the water shortage in the next near term years for Manila. So I guess anticipation is always there. It's a question of who makes this anticipation, a question of how long are we anticipating things for. And there's a concept called maladaptation, wherein adaptation strategies for the moment actually work for the moment. But then say in the next season, a drought, a flood, or another extreme comes in. And then what you did for the previous disaster or for the previous risk does not work anymore. And I think that shows a lack of anticipation that things actually change over time. And I would like, I think, to put forward, I think in my PhD, the concept of dynamic adaptation, and also thinking about consequences of certain and current adaptation. Not because it worked today, it will work again in the future, it will work again in the next season. So it requires government, communities to actually actively and proactively think about what changes they want to respond to, and the kinds of actions that they can actually do, because there are certain things that communities cannot do. As Jaishi said, there's a concept also called like path dependency. So communities become dependent on dams, on dikes, on levees, or also on external aids, financial aids being given to communities, which also affect the type of anticipation that governments and communities can do. So yeah, I don't know if that it's a clear answer, but
Yeah, I think yeah, it was pretty clear, and I think it's a good takeaway for today that anticipation is always there. But navigating the anticipation, the power, and who, like how long you are anticipating for, how the diversity in the organizations is, of the kind of thinking that goes into anticipation. I think all of that needs to change and become more plural, more holistic, and more inclusive. So, with that, I would like to close this session and provide a small token of appreciation to our speakers. So, these are some drawings that we have made of you, because giving you a gift voucher or something is not something that you will. It's not the most sustainable thing out there, because online shopping is, we know, quite bad for the environment. So you will
Yes,
receive these.
cool. Please do send it to me.
Yeah, we have sent them to you.
Send it to us. It's super cute.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for speaking to the community today and enriching the community with your ideas and your research. We look forward to having you again sometime soon and speaking to our community once again. And yeah, thank you all for coming and joining us in the audience. And yeah, I would wish you all a good evening, good afternoon, and good morning. And yeah, thank you all for coming.
Thank you for inviting us. Have a great day.
Have a great rest of your day.
Bye bye.